Hello, everybody. This is Mark Turman with the Denison Forum and a Pastor's View. We're here for another conversation. We have Dr. Jim Denison, the Chief Vision Officer of the Denison Forum. And joining us today is Tyrone Johnson. We'll introduce him to you in just a little bit, but we're celebrating today Black History Month and focusing in on the important topic of race relations. Now, we know that this podcast is coming to you a little bit late. It probably appeared just after the end of February. And you hopefully know that February is Black History Month, but we've been delayed a little bit because of Texas weather and some other issues that have caused us to delay our recording. But it also serves another purpose, as Tyrone has already reminded us, which is Black history should not be just focused on at 1 month of the year, but all through our lives as we try to think about the needs and opportunities to make the reality of racism and those accompanying problems better. And so we're going to talk about those things today. I'm going to look for opportunities to add to this conversation, but Dr. Jim and Tyrone are longstanding friends, having served at a church here in the Dallas area. Tyrone is a worship pastor still in the Dallas area, and he'll tell you a little bit more about his story. But Jim, why don't you tell us how you and Tyrone know each other?
Well, thank you. Tyrone's probably scared about what I'm about to say now, but we know things about each other, right? Tyrone and I are neighbors as well, and he is one of my very dearest friends. I first met Tyrone when I was pastoring a church in Dallas, as you said, and Ty was hired to be the worship leader in our contemporary service. And first time he did that, the first Saturday night, I knew there was absolutely something anointed, something just extremely unusual about Tyrone and his wife, Angela. I remember when Faith and Mark, their twins, were born. Tyrone, I remember when you brought them to church a few weeks after that. And now here they are, graduated from high school, going off to college. And remarkable to hear that, to think about that. So we've been in touch across all of these years. Tyrone leads worship for us when we go to Israel. He's done that, I don't know, maybe 10 times, something like that over the years as well. We've done a lot of work together. Something I want to say very quickly before we move on in this context is I've asked Tyrone on regular occasions to help me to understand race relations issues in this country, in this culture. And that's part of our conversation today. But that's only partly because he's African-American. All right, I just want you to understand that. The rest of that, the largest part of that is because he is brilliant. It's because he is anointed. It's because he is gifted on so many levels. Tyrone has an undergraduate degree, a master's in biblical interpretation and study from Dallas Baptist University. I'm urging him to get a PhD next. He brings such value to the conversation, regardless of his own personal ethnicity. It's just his own story that brings that level of conversation as well. So, but he's here not only because he can speak out of his experience, but also because I so value his mind, his gifts, his excellence, and because he's such a dear friend. And it's just such a great privilege to be in this conversation with him again today.
Thank you, Jim. Tyrone, why don't you say hello and tell us a little bit about how you know Jim?
Be careful, Ty. Be careful.
Okay. Soft words.
All right.
Again, Jim mentioned that we met, we served together at a church. And I remember the first time I heard him speak, it could have been the same way he felt about me when I would leave service after listening to Jim. There was always a calling in my heart to be better than I was the week before. And it has always been a constant, be better than I was the week before. And he just has well, of course, his knowledge of the Bible and history is just phenomenal. But the way he can interpret that and put that into today's situation, in today's culture, and in today's just questions and confusions is always beautiful. And to go to Israel with him, as many times as I've gone, each time is like the first, because he makes it feel like it's brand new. And he brings not only the Bible to life, but he brings that country and just that land and just the purpose of that land to life. And every time I go, for me, it's a spiritual rejuvenation. And I'm always honored and blessed to be with him. It's just one of the joys I have in my life.
Yeah, thank you, Tyrone.
Well, we want to talk today about not only Black history, but obviously the challenges of racism. And I'd just like to start today by reading a quote that came across my email this morning from the author and pastor Frederick Buechner. He wrote at one time in 1988, in 1957, when Governor Faubus of Arkansas refused to desegregate the schools in Little Rock, if President Eisenhower, with all of his enormous prestige and personality, had led a black child up the steps where the authorities were blocking the school entrance, it might have been one of the greatest moments in history. Heartbreaking to think of the opportunity missed. Nothing in American history is more tragic, surely, than the relationship of black and white races. Masters and slaves were both dehumanized. The Jim Crow laws carried the process on for decades beyond the emancipation. The Ku Klux Klan and its like kept going forever. Politically, economically, socially, and humanly, black people continue to be the underdog. Despite all the efforts of both races to rectify the situation and to heal the wounds, despite all the progress that has been made, it is still as hard for any black person to look at any white person without a feeling of resentment as it is for any white person to look at any black person without a feeling of guilt. And I would add to that perhaps a feeling of fear. Jim, if you could share with us a little bit your perspective of the biblical historical roots of racism and come from and what Jesus experienced as it related to forms of racism in his day.
Yeah, Mark, thank you. And first of all, thank you for the Frederick Buechner quote. I think he's absolutely right. I think he's absolutely spot on. I've actually been to that high school, to that school where this could have all been so different had President Eisenhower taken that step. And I would hope that I would, on some level, be up to the moment today, whatever that moment looks like for me and for us as well. So I think you start very quickly on the biblical level by thinking about this racism as it is in Scripture. Racism can be defined in a variety of ways. One way to see it is the dehumanizing of an individual, the prejudice toward an individual based on their ethnicity or their race. That is a sin. All right, just pure and simple. That's a sin against God. That's a sin against the other. And that's actually a sin against the individual. It's first is obviously a sin against God. Scripture says in Genesis 1 that all of us are made in the image of God, every single one of us. A sin against my son is a sin against me. A sin against anyone in my family is a sin against me. Galatians 3 says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all Abraham's seed and heirs according to the covenant. Second, racism is a sin against the other. It's clearly on any level that we dehumanize another person, we're dehumanizing someone for whom Jesus died, someone made in the very image of God, and that is nothing less than a sin. It also, as Buechner said, is a sin against us. When I dehumanize others, I dehumanize myself. I make myself less than God intends me to be. Hate and bigotry and prejudice injure the one who hates, even as they injure the person who is hated as well. We see this in the life of Jesus. We see Jesus reaching out across the races of his day, across the demographics of his day, by caring for Gentiles in a time when Jews believed Gentiles should be firewood in hell, by caring for women at a time when there were many in the culture who saw women as the possession of men, by touching lepers, by caring for those with disease at a time when it was thought that if you had disease, this was a mark of sin. All of that was Jesus saying to us today that all people are loved equally by the God who loves us all. I close with this statement that I some years ago saw in St. Augustine, who said, God loves each of us as if there were only one of us. Mm-hmm. That is true, Mark, of all of us, of all race, creed, color, tradition, background, whatever that is. That's how God feels about each of us. Jesus died for each of us. That's a real privilege to say that to you and to Tyrone in this conversation.
Well, Tyrone, share a little bit about your perspective. I know you and Jim have likely talked about this a number of different times, but what is your perspective about Black history, an awareness of Black history? I was talking not long ago to an African-American pastor here in Houston, and I just finally got the chance to ask him the question, what is it as an African-American person, what is it that you want? And I think the best answer he gave was that I just want people to listen. That's what I want right now. What's your perspective on not only Black history, but also race relations as they are today?
My perspective of the way I think about Black history is okay, to me, I think to suppress the history of Black people is to suppress the value of Black people. Mm-hmm. So when the history of America and the history of Black people in America has never really been told honestly and completely. So within that, you have a lot of misinformation. You have a lot of information that was left out. And a perfect example for my kids, we teach our kids Black history. We teach our kids the value of those inventors, the doctors, all of those people that made contributions to the world and to America that nobody else knows about. Mm-hmm. And I think if those truths would have been told over the years the way everything else is told, I think the way Black people are viewed or the way that they are valued would be changed, because they would realize that, okay, that there is more to them than just the part of that we want to tell. Because when you think about history, especially Black history, it's told from those that were in power. And so those that in power are telling the story. So if they're telling the story, they can leave out what they want. And so now, to this day, perfect example, last summer, when all of the race challenges were going on, what I was trying to do was just post things that people may not have known about. So I posted just a history recollection of the fires of Wall Street, about the riots in Wall Street when there was a massacre in Oklahoma. And I was amazed at how many people had never heard of that. I was amazed at, they was like, is this true? Mm-hmm. And if you ask a Black person, we know it's true because we know that history. But for something to happen like that in a state and half of the state didn't even know about it, that's just a small sign of one incident. So when you take that and multiply it over 50 states and all the things that would happen like that, has just been suppressed or not told, then it's hard for people to understand, well, what do they want? Well, all we ask for is just to be treated like everyone else. Treat me like you would treat your son. If you're right. Treat my children or my son the way you would treat yours. And nobody's asking for anything more. We're just asking to be treated the same.
Yeah. And I had similar experience. I'm a native Texan, lived within 150 miles of Dallas my whole life, basically. But when the story in Oklahoma broke last year, I didn't know that part of history. About 2 years ago, I went on a pastor-sponsored trip to Washington, D.C., and part of that trip included a tour of the African-American Museum right on the mall. And I was captivated by the story of Emmett Till. I lived my whole life in Texas, never heard the story of Emmett Till. And it just reminded me, it's when people say that we're trying to rewrite history, I think, no, we're just adding the chapters that haven't been included.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah, that's how history gets done. You know, in philosophy classes, we talk about a philosophy of history, a way in which you look at history. The Western history model is linear, for instance. We think of past, present, future, whereas an Eastern model, to be probably too generic, would be more cyclical. You might think of a reincarnation motif. In an existentialist day-to-day, it's very chaotic. You just think of dots on the wall, and all of these are various dots. Well, one of the points you make when you get interested in historiography or the philosophy of history is that history has to be subjective and selective by nature. This conversation is probably not going to make somebody's history of America at some point, unless we did something horribly tragic. If someone walked into one of our offices with a gun or something, then this might make the news tonight, right? So someone makes a decision, even if they reflect an historical event accurately, which seldom happens, even whether they include it or not. And so to Tyrone's point, if my narrative is one that does not want to consider the kind of injustice the kind of systemic racism, the kind of historic injustice that is part of the American story from the first time that we began encountering indigenous Americans, not to mention the time that we began enslaving African Americans. If I don't want that to be part of my story, and I have no good way to tell those chapters, I just leave them out. History is written by the winners, just like the maps get drawn by the winners of the wars. I just simply leave them out. There's no good way to tell the Emmett Till story and have it be aligned with a narrative that wants to leave out injustice. So I just don't tell the story. And that all by itself, to add, and that, Tyrone, obviously I can't speak for you, but for me, I would feel enormously dehumanized by the degree to which significant parts of my story simply aren't known. It's one thing to tell them wrongly. It's another thing to ignore them completely.
Altogether.
I think there's nothing worse than completely being ignored, and so you don't exist. And that's so much of the Black story in America, I'm afraid.
Right. Yeah. It's true. It's very true.
Tyrone, I heard a quote just a couple of weeks ago where the author basically was saying that we now have a generation, particularly those 30, 35 and under, who are growing up in an environment where they equate power with corruption or evil. How would you respond to that? Do you think that is going on, and what's your thoughts to the degree that may be happening? That there's this idea that whoever is holding power is automatically corrupt.
I don't think whoever holds power is automatically corrupt. I think there is a when you hold power, and when you use that power mostly to keep others from having power, I don't think that's more of a corrupt. There's more fear there, because the fear then is, well, if I lose my power and they get the power, they're going to treat me the way I've treated them. So I don't think it's corrupt, but it's almost, because when you hear somebody say, well, you would think about doing this, that, and the other, I was like, why would I even think about that? Because my mind isn't set on that. But when you think about what can I do to keep this person down, or what can I do to keep them from getting this, or what can I do from it? And then when it flips and they get the power, you're going to think that they're going to be thinking what you were thinking. So I think those that hold power, there's a fear of, if I don't do everything I can to maintain it, if I lose it, they're going to treat me the same way I treated them.
Could we start equating that other people are going to act and think the way we do in that situation?
Yes.
Now, that's a basic fact of history. I can't accuse you of something that doesn't occur to me.
Right.
Just by definition. I don't know what I don't know. And Tyrone, that's a point I think white people like me need to continue to hear. We need to try to imagine how we would respond if the culture shifted in such a way that we and our children were treated the way Black people have historically, stereotypically, but really across categories been treated in this culture. Quick example that I could tell of a story that Tyrone and I have talked about. As I mentioned, we're neighbors here living in North Dallas. There's a pharmacy in our neighborhood that both of us frequent quite often. Tyrone tells me, because I've asked him, he didn't tell me except I asked him, when he goes into that pharmacy, he's got to make certain he doesn't wear sunglasses. He's got to make sure he doesn't wear a hoodie. And even still, there's a good chance an employee is going to follow him around the entire time he's there. When his kids are walking in the neighborhood, they've got to make certain to walk in the street or maybe on the sidewalk, but certainly nothing that would appear to somebody in our predominantly white neighborhood as though they are trying to make their way to somebody's front door. And then there was this horrible time that Tyrone's daughter was going door to door in our neighborhood selling tickets for a theater production at their Christian high school. One of the families, when she knocked on the door, called the police. And Tyrone had to come and explain to the police what his daughter was doing. If that were to happen to one of my sons, my sons had to be that way, if I had to think that going into a pharmacy, that's the point. I think it's critical for us on this side of this conversation to ask ourselves, how would we respond if the shoe was on our foot, if the situation was ours? Because it could so easily be there. And that will cause us to understand with perhaps more empathy the reality of the situation as it is today. And I'll add one more point. Many in my side of the conversation, if I want to put it that way, Tyrone, and we've talked about this, think this was over in 1964.
Oh, yeah.
Civil rights legislation solved this, didn't it? Right. You look at white evangelicals, and something like 18% will say race is a major problem in America. You ask black evangelicals, and 83% will say race is still a major problem in America. So conversations like this, I hope, continue to cause us to understand that while I'm grateful for legislative progress, while we're grateful for what steps we have taken, we are nowhere near where we need to be, and we won't be until we do what Tyrone just said, until we treat everybody like we treat anybody.
Right.
Until we get to that place, we're not done.
Right. And that's right. And going back to the story that Jim told about my daughter, so she was walking around the neighborhood and she had gone to the house before, and the husband was there. And he came to the door and she said, "I'm selling tickets for the play," and he said, "Oh, come back. And I want to talk to my wife and see how many tickets I need." And she goes back to the house that she had gone to. So it wasn't like a new house.
Yeah.
She go back and the person didn't even open the door, call the police. So my wife was home and my daughter's sitting there my wife drives up, there are 2 police cars and my daughter's sitting there. My wife's, "Is this the house?" So my daughter's sitting there with 2 cops and the lady's apologizing profusely, but the image is already in her mind. So now my daughter has to remember, okay, life changes for me. And the thing that is hard for people to understand when they look at youth and black kids and why they do, because there's a built-in fear that we already have.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to tell my daughter, "Oh, you can't be like other kids and go around and set." You don't want to set that up. But at some point, I have to talk to my son. "Okay, buddy, when you go with your friends, look, don't be the one. Don't be the one that's loud. Don't be one that's running around. Let them run around because you're going to be seen way different than they are." So you end up squashing your kids' time of life when they're supposed to be able to just have fun, because you have to put your kids, especially if they're black, on a more protective mode. So they just can't go out and have fun and be free. They have to, "Okay, no, I can't do that. Or I don't need to do that," because that's hard for people to understand, because they don't have to. Most white parents don't have to have race conversations with their kids.
Right. That's right.
Because it's not needed. Right. All black parents have to have race conversations with their kids, because it's life or death.
And this is not 1958. This is
no.
21.
This is now. You saw the story of a young man who was walking home in the snow and got arrested because he was walking home in the snow.
Okay, so let me ask a question of both of you, if I could, because both of you are serving on a church staff at this point in time. I obviously have done that in the past, but I'm not at that point at the present. I know we need to close before long. What are some steps in your mind churches and church leaders can take to help their congregations as well as their community get to the place that Tyrone has set as our goal, a place where we treat everybody the way we treat anybody? What are some practical steps in your minds that can be taken even today by those that are hearing this conversation?
Tyrone, go ahead.
Okay, this gets okay. This is always challenging for me because I don't see us all as Christians. I see us all as Christ followers. And sometimes people get stuck on the Christian thing because as a title, and not Christ follower as a life we lead. I know that the whole race discrimination, racism, white supremacy, all of that stuff could have been squashed years ago. But a lot of it was perpetuated by the church.
You're right.
So in order to reverse that, it needs to be addressed in the church. It's not something that's just going to happen, because if pastors are afraid to talk about it, if pastors are afraid to confront their congregation that may have views that don't lean towards Christ's views, if they're afraid to do that, we're not going to get any further than where we are now. That's the only way this is going to change. And there's a lot of churches that are struggling right now because they're trying to figure out, how do I address this and not make my congregation too upset with me? Because and so it's a balance. At some point, you have to decide. Okay, I'm taking the stand here. You can be with us or not, but we're going to follow Christ's example and what he calls us to be, and not what I need to be, so you won't go anywhere. That's where it needs to start, and that's where it needs to end.
That's a call to courage. Quick example of that quickly, and then Mark, I wanted to ask you the same thing. I do white papers quite often that we put on our website, and then we often generate a lot of media interest around those and do a lot of interviews around those. So I wrote a paper, What Does the Bible Say About Racism, after the George Floyd tragic death. And we sent that out to the same outlets that we have done this in the past. Not one interview that was generated off that paper. And so we asked our agency why they thought that was. And their belief was it was going to take a certain amount of courage to have those conversations in some of those radio outlets. And they felt that was why there was not the response to the paper we were hoping for, which is, again, a way of saying, Tyrone, there's a courage in this, courage of convictions. That's the essential step that we have to pray about, ask for, and be willing to take the sacrificial step toward. So, well, Mark, having been to your church any number of times in the Dallas area, one of the many things I love about your congregation that you founded back some years ago is the degree to which your church exhibits, in my mind, a much broader cross-section of our culture than a church typically does, across races, across various demographics, across various age categories. And I know that's been intentional for you. And I also know you've been doing across the years some things to be very intentional as a pastor. So let me ask you to speak into that very quickly. What are some steps you could suggest out of your experience?
Well, I think two or three things come to mind, which we've been trying to work on, which is part of it just let me begin at the congregational level, which is looking for the places where you can talk about this repetitively, particularly in preaching and teaching opportunities. Even this Sunday, I'm preaching from the last part of Ephesians or 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Part of what it says about the ministry of the church is that we are to help the weak. And one of the ways to understand that word weak is to help those who are disadvantaged, those who are socially and economically disadvantaged, those who have less power and less opportunity in the culture that they should. And that you could talk about helping the weak in a lot of different ways. We love to talk about helping orphans and widows, but we need to continue to bring the light onto these larger issues and onto the systemic issues. Another thing that I took a risk doing a few months ago was I asked the small group that I'm a part of to be willing to do a book study of a book about racial history in America and about race relations, written by a guy named Jamar Tisby. And I can tell you, it was one of the most uncomfortable small group experiences that all of us have been in. And it was one of the most lively conversations. And about halfway through, I said to my group, I said, we studied Ephesians and we studied Philippians and we studied Colossians before we got to this book. And none of you had as much to say about any of those letters as you do about this. And it was raw conversation, to be honest with you. It was hard. And then, but doing those things, I think, pushes people to have to think more deeply. And then the third thing is really just personal. I doubt that I would have gone into the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. had the sponsors not said, this is our itinerary. And I would have missed out on what that experience was all about. I would have chosen the Smithsonian or something else. And so I'm trying to remind myself to move toward those things that I'm not instinctively comfortable with. A month ago when, my dad, I had a great dad, but my dad was a product of his upbringing, and he didn't like the fact that his birthday was shared by the remembrance of Martin Luther King in January. And he commented the last number of years of his life that he didn't like being associated with that day. But last month, I decided to try to do something to increase my awareness. And so on Martin Luther King Day, I decided to find an audible version of the letter from the Birmingham jail, because I was required to read a portion of it when I was in an ethics class in college. And I remember how important it was, but I was reminded of that on that day. And so I went and found what turned out to be an hour-long reading by King himself of that letter, and found it to be incredibly profound, not just as it relates to race relations, but as it relates to a lot of things that we're dealing with in our culture still today. And I kind of made a personal commitment that I wanted to do that at least once a year, if not 2 or 3 times a year, to be reminded of the power and the wisdom, the logic, and the biblical truth of what he expressed in what one person said is probably the most important and profound thing he ever wrote or said. And so pushing myself to swim in this water more consistently, I think and I hope is helping me and my church.
Thank you for that, Mark.
So we want to thank y'all. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think at the end of the day, those hearing or listening to this, I think should ask the Lord, okay, what's my next step? What is it that I am to do? What relationships am I to initiate? What sins am I to confess? What repentance am I to make public? What reparations am I to make? What is it you want me to do to take the initiative toward a better future? How are you to use my influence to make a difference in this culture? That practical outcome is what we're praying for as a result of this conversation, and an outcome that I know the Lord is praying for right now. As Jesus prayed in John 17, that we would be one so the world will believe the Father sent the Son. And as Tyrone said, it starts inside the church. We can't ask the culture to do what we're not willing to do. We can't lead for where we're willing to go. We can't give what we don't have. And so let's take Mark's example and Tyrone's example, and let's ask the Lord what our next step is inside. That would be my ask of those that are part of this conversation today, Mark. Thanks. Absolutely.
Well, we're going to leave it right there for today. Tyrone, thank you for being a part of this conversation. We look forward to continuing it and expanding upon it in the future.